Title: Abyssal Secrets. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The letter came on a cold, storm-ravaged evening, sealed in a heavy, brass-edged envelope. Its arrival was as silent as the creeping fog that had begun to settle over the city. Alexander Fedorov, a marine biologist with a taste for the ocean's uncharted territories, never had time for letters. His life was a constant whirl of data, cold analyses, and long hours spent submerged in the depths of unknown ecosystems. But something about the heavy weight of the envelope unsettled him before he even opened it. He stared at the brass seal, strange, unmarked, foreign, before gently breaking it, as if fearing the contents might unravel the delicate fabric of his existence. Inside, the paper was thick, made of a quality that suggested wealth, or perhaps danger. The script, scrawled in dark ink, seemed oddly personal, the letters curling like tendrils that grew too long and strangled the page. Dr. Alexander Fedorov, we are pleased to offer you a position within Project Abyss. Your expertise is required for a highly confidential, government-funded expedition. This opportunity will provide resources beyond your wildest expectations. Further details will be shared upon your acceptance. Your response is expected within the next 48 hours. The words were simple, precise, but they held an undeniable weight. Alexander had heard rumors, whispers of a secret government project, something tied to the deepest, most dangerous parts of the world's oceans. But those were just stories, things that passed through the halls of scientific journals and whispered among colleagues over drinks. They never seemed real. Yet, here it was, in black ink, staring at him. Project Abyss. The invitation was impossible to ignore. It was exactly what he had been waiting for. An opportunity to truly explore the unexplored. For years, Alexander had felt the pull of the ocean's depths, a magnetic force that gnawed at his every thought, beckoning him toward the dark unknowns beneath the surface. He had long been captivated by the mysteries that lay hidden in the dark trenches, places where light could not pierce, where no man had ventured for fear of what they might uncover. The abyss. The thought sent a cold shiver crawling down his spine. He set the letter aside, hands trembling. There was something wrong with it, something off, but the nagging curiosity that had defined his entire career was already pushing aside his rational thoughts. He had to know more. He needed to know what Project Abyss was truly about. The call of the unknown. It wasn't long before his phone rang. Dr. Fedorov, a deep voice on the other end said, smooth and almost too calm. I trust you've received the invitation. Alexander felt a chill settle over him at the sound of that voice. It was the same voice as the one from the letter, a voice that seemed to carry the weight of ages with it, as if it had existed far beyond the bounds of time itself. I have, Alexander replied, though his throat felt tight. And I assume you'll be explaining just what Project Abyss entails. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Alexander thought the connection had been severed, but then the voice returned, softer now, almost a whisper. Not over the phone. This is a matter for face-to-face discussion, Doctor. Your curiosity is noted, but you must be prepared for what comes next. He could feel the smile in the voice, and it unsettled him more than anything. What's required of me? Alexander asked, though he could already guess. He could already feel the pull of the abyss, how it beckoned, as if the ocean itself were calling him, drawing him into its depths. We'll send for you. Prepare to leave in the next few days, the voice said, before the line went dead. The journey. A few days later, Alexander found himself boarding a nondescript jet, the windows blacked out and the interior sterile, cold. There were no details, no personal touches, the kind of jet you wouldn't remember being on once it had landed. As he settled into his seat, he noticed there were no other passengers, only a few crew members, all in sharp, unmarked suits. They didn't speak to him, didn't offer pleasantries. It felt like they weren't even aware of his presence, as if he was just another cog in a machine that he hadn't yet understood. The flight was long, far longer than it should have been. Alexander spent hours staring out the window at the endless sea below, feeling the pull of the deep water beneath tugging at his mind. The closer they flew to their destination, the more he felt the weight of something pressing down on him. It was as if the very air had grown thicker, more oppressive, the darkness of the ocean creeping into his mind. The jet finally landed on an isolated strip of land, surrounded by nothing but an unbroken horizon of water. No town, no buildings, just a small, utilitarian structure that barely seemed to rise from the earth. A black helicopter waited for him, its engines already running. He was ushered into it without question, and the helicopter took off almost immediately. They flew over a vast stretch of ocean, the waters below as dark and endless as the night sky above. For hours, they traveled deeper into the ocean than he had ever been, heading toward a location marked only by coordinates on a screen. And then, they descended into the abyss. The helicopter landed atop a floating platform, a massive, gleaming structure that seemed almost unnatural. The sea around it was still and silent, the air thick with the salt of the ocean. As he stepped off the helicopter, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a sharp suit, his face pale and expressionless. "Dr. Fedorov," the man said, his voice flat, almost monotone. "Welcome to Abyss 3. The facility was like nothing Alexander had ever seen before, an underwater research station of unimaginable scale. Its walls were made of reinforced titanium, and the structure seemed to stretch deep beneath the water's surface, as if it were a part of the ocean itself. The very atmosphere inside felt strange, oppressive, as if the ocean's weight were pressing down on every inch of the station. As Alexander was led inside, the feeling of dread only deepened. The hallways were long, stretching into shadow, with no windows to the outside world. The sounds of the sea seemed to echo through the walls, a low, rhythmic pulse that felt both natural and alien at the same time. It was as if the station was not just built on the ocean, but inside it. "You'll be working closely with the team here," the man said, his voice still flat. "But be warned, Dr. Fedorov, the ocean has its own rules, and sometimes it does not appreciate being disturbed." The first night at Abyss 3 was the hardest. Alexander couldn't sleep. His room was small, furnished with minimal comforts, and the hum of the station was constant. He tried to read, tried to distract himself from the creeping sense of unease that filled the space, but there was nothing to hold his attention. The sound of the ocean outside was deafening, a constant roar that made him feel as though the sea itself was waiting, watching, listening. Around midnight, the lights in his room flickered. He chalked it up to the station's age, or perhaps a power surge, but the sensation of being watched remained. A faint noise echoed in the distance, a scraping sound, like claws against metal. The noise was soft at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, closer. His heart began to race, and he stood from the bed, straining to hear. Was it just the wind, the pressure of the ocean, or something more? A sudden pounding on his door jolted him from his thoughts. "Dr. Fedorov, are you all right?" The voice outside his door was urgent, tinged with panic. "There's something down here." Alexander didn't know what to say. He could hear the fear in the voice, the crackling tension that hinted at something far worse than just mechanical failure. He stepped toward the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. As he opened it, the air outside his room was thick with a heavy, acrid smell, salt, oil, and something else, something foul, like decay. The hall outside was empty. No one was there, and yet, the feeling that he was not alone never left. To be continued. This is a portion of the opening chapter, establishing the eerie atmosphere, introducing the protagonist, and setting up the growing sense of dread. I've focused on creating a slow build-up, layering small unsettling details to establish the tone and psychological horror. This structure would continue to develop throughout the rest of the chapter and story, leading up to the deeper mysteries of the Abyssal Trench. Chapter 2. The Depths Beneath. Alexander Fedorov awoke, his body heavy, his mind thick with fog. The first thing he noticed was the silence, the kind of silence that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. There was no chirping of birds, no distant hum of city life, no gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. Just a suffocating, oppressive quiet that clung to everything. It was unnatural, the sort of silence that felt like it was hiding something, waiting, watching. The silence of the ocean. He opened his eyes to a small, dimly lit room. His quarters on Abyss 3 were functional, yet the sterile, unadorned walls made it feel like a tomb. The faintest hum of the station's machinery reverberated through the floor, but even that seemed muted, distant, as if the sound was being absorbed by the water pressing in from all sides. The clock on the wall ticked, though the minutes seemed to stretch unnaturally. Every second, every breath felt stretched thin, caught between two worlds, one that was alive and one that was a graveyard. The bed was a narrow, cold slab that seemed to resist him. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't inviting either. He swung his legs over the side and sat up, rubbing his eyes, attempting to clear away the heaviness that still clouded his thoughts. There were no windows in his room, no glimpse of the world above. Just the dark, crushing pressure of the ocean surrounding the station. His first thought was to check the time, but when his hand reached for his wrist, he froze. The motion felt wrong, disjointed, as if his own body was a foreign entity. Slowly, he looked at his hand. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the veins beneath seemed to pulse unnaturally. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly alive. He stood, his muscles protesting, and glanced around the room. The air felt stale, as if it hadn't been replaced for hours, maybe days. There was no breeze, no ventilation, just the heavy, stagnant atmosphere of a place that had been sealed off from the world for far too long. He walked to the door and stepped out into the narrow corridor. The station, though large, felt claustrophobic. The ceilings were too low, the walls too close. The harsh, fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He walked without purpose, each footstep echoing off the cold metal flooring, amplifying his sense of isolation. The hallway stretched in endless directions, all of them leading nowhere. The same utilitarian doors, the same sterile walls, the faint smell of salt water and metal. He turned a corner, and there in front of him stood Dr. Carter Hayes, the lead scientist of Project Abyss. Hayes was tall, his movements stiff, and his face impassive, almost clinical. There was a coldness in his eyes, a detachment that Alexander found unsettling, as if Hayes viewed everything through a lens that stripped away humanity. "Dr. Fedorov," Hayes greeted him with a curt nod. "I trust you're adjusting well?" Alexander forced a smile, but it felt brittle. "It's taking some getting used to," he said, his voice thick, as if he were speaking underwater. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, something deeper than just the isolation of being submerged in the ocean. He wanted to ask questions, but something in Hayes's expression made him hesitate. Hayes' eyes flickered to the hallway behind him, then back to Alexander, and without a word, he turned, motioning for Alexander to follow. "You'll get used to the silence," Hayes said, as they walked down the corridor. "It's the silence of the ocean, the silence of something ancient." They passed a series of doors, each one leading to small rooms filled with equipment, monitors, computers, and strange machinery that Alexander couldn't even begin to identify. The soft hum of the station was almost deafening here, vibrating through the walls and floor, a constant reminder of the vast, oppressive ocean outside. "There's something calming about it, don't you think?" Hayes asked, his voice strangely reflective. "The ocean, I mean. It's almost like it's alive, a living entity that you can feel pressing against you. And we're just guests in its domain." The words sent a chill down Alexander's spine, but he didn't voice it. The strange way Hayes spoke about the ocean, like it was a presence, something sentient, unnerved him, but he chose not to comment. He had been sent here to conduct research, not to dwell on strange theories. They arrived at the central control room, a space filled with technology so advanced it looked like it had come from a different world. Banks of monitors blinked in the dim light, and large glass tanks lined the walls. Inside the tanks, the water swirled, dark and inky, illuminated only by the dim glow of the control lights. The tanks were filled with various specimens, but it was hard to make out the shapes in the murk. Alexander could feel the weight of the ocean pressing in on them, even inside this chamber. It was as though the water outside wasn't just a physical force. It was something more. "Here," Hayes said, gesturing to the farthest tank. "This is our most significant discovery so far." Alexander stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The tank contained something large, too large for its confines. Its form was twisted, its body a mass of shadow and shifting, indistinct shapes. It resembled nothing Alexander had ever seen. It was not an animal, not a creature that could be classified. It defied classification. Its very existence made Alexander's skin crawl. "What is it?" he whispered, unable to keep the tremor out of his voice. Hayes stared at it for a long time, his eyes narrowing. "We've never encountered anything like it before. It was found at the deepest part of the trench, something that shouldn't even exist." Alexander felt a shiver run through him. "How deep is that?" "Deeper than anything we were prepared for," Hayes said cryptically. "What we're dealing with is far older than us. It's not just an organism, it's a relic, and it's not the only one." The words didn't make sense, but Alexander didn't interrupt. Hayes continued, his voice low, almost reverent. "It's a message, Fedorov," Hayes said, his gaze never leaving the tank. "The ocean has been here long before us, and it will be here long after we're gone. But we have a responsibility now, a responsibility to understand it, to listen." The weight of his words pressed down on Alexander like a vice. He wanted to look away, to escape, but something in the creature's shape held him there. It wasn't just the mystery of what it was. It was the overwhelming sense that it was watching him, that it knew he was there. It felt sentient, intelligent. He opened his mouth to ask another question, but before he could, Hayes spoke again, his voice sharp and commanding. "You'll meet the rest of the team tomorrow. For now, you need to rest. There's a lot more to see, and you're not ready yet." Alexander nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He had come here to make sense of the mysteries of the deep, but he had not expected this. He had not expected to feel so insignificant, as if they were all ants standing on the edge of a vast, unknowable chasm, with nothing but the ocean's dark maw waiting to consume them. The darkness within. Later that night, when the station was eerily quiet, Alexander couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his thoughts swirling. The silence was unbearable, the hum of the station like a distant, far-off heartbeat. He could almost feel the ocean pressing in from every direction, its vastness overwhelming him. His mind kept returning to the creature in the tank. What was it? Where had it come from? And why did it seem so aware? The thought of it haunted him, gnawing at his thoughts like a persistent whisper. He climbed out of bed, pulling on his shoes, his body moving on autopilot. He found himself walking through the dark, deserted corridors once again, though this time he wasn't sure why. It was as if something was pulling him, guiding him, compelling him to see something, to understand. When he reached the observation room, the tanks were dark. The flickering lights cast long, jittery shadows across the floor. He stepped closer to the largest tank, his heart racing in his chest. The water inside was still, too still. Then, a movement. For a moment, he wasn't sure what he had seen, but something shifted inside the tank. It was too fast, too sudden for his eyes to follow. He leaned closer, his breath shallow, his hands clammy against the cold glass. And then he saw it. The creature, the thing, was there. It was larger than he remembered, its form twisting, its shadow stretching out of the water like a hand reaching for him. He froze. The eyes, those black, endless eyes, were there again, staring back at him. He could feel it now, the presence behind him, in the room with him, watching, waiting. Chapter 3. Beneath the Surface. The morning did not bring comfort. In fact, it never seemed to come at all. The soft, muted hum of the Abyss 3 station reverberated in the walls, as if the very building were alive, breathing with the rhythms of the deep ocean. Alexander Fedorov sat at his desk, staring at the flickering monitors in front of him, his fingers numb from the cold metal beneath his palms. His thoughts drifted, always back to the dark, inexplicable presence he'd felt the previous night in the observation room. The thing in the tank. His mind kept replaying that moment, his eyes locked with those black, endless orbs, the weight of their gaze pressing down on him like an invisible hand. He couldn't understand it. The creature had been still, dormant even, yet there was something about it that felt aware, alive, not just in the physical sense, but in a way that was far more unnerving, as if it had been waiting for him. He had tried to dismiss it, tell himself it was just the isolation, the claustrophobia of the station making him imagine things, but there was no denying it. Something in that tank had moved, and in the silence of the station, that feeling of being watched had only grown stronger. Alexander leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage the tension away. The silence around him was thick, like the water outside pressing against the station's walls, the pressure mounting. In this place, the boundaries between human and unknown had blurred, and he was beginning to feel like he was no longer in control of his own thoughts. Something had shifted, and he wasn't sure if it was the station, the ocean, or something else entirely. The sudden chime of his console startled him, pulling him from his thoughts. A message had come through, an encrypted communication from Dr. Carter Hayes, the lead scientist on Project Abyss. His heart skipped a beat. There had been something in Hayes's eyes the day before, a strange look, an unreadable expression that hadn't gone unnoticed. It was almost as if Hayes had known exactly what he'd seen, as though the scientist was aware of something he himself hadn't fully grasped. The message on the screen was brief but urgent. Fedorov, you are to report to the submersible docking bay immediately. There's been an anomaly. Do not tell anyone. Do not discuss this with anyone else on the team. Understood? The words hit him like a cold wave. An anomaly. What did Hayes mean by that? He felt his breath quicken, his body reacting instinctively to the urgency in the message. Without a second thought, he stood and headed for the docking bay. It wasn't far, just down the corridor and past a few of the more secure areas. His boots echoed in the silence as he walked, the only sound in the hollow emptiness of the station. The closer he got, the heavier the air seemed to become. A thick, almost suffocating weight pressed in on him, as though the walls themselves were closing in. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, the adrenaline surging through him, the anxiety, the fear. It wasn't normal. It was something deeper, something primal. When he reached the docking bay, Hayes was already there, standing in front of a large sealed hatch. The dim fluorescent lights flickered above them, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Hayes didn't turn around at first, but when he did, his face was unreadable, cold. You received my message, Hayes said, his voice low and almost detached. Good. We need to move quickly. Move quickly? What's going on, Hayes? Alexander's voice cracked with frustration. What's this anomaly you're talking about? Hayes didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the hatch and keyed in a code on the terminal beside it. There was a moment of silence before the lock disengaged with a soft hiss, and the hatch slowly began to open. The air that spilled out was cool, like the breath of the ocean itself. It smelled of metal and salt water, thick and damp, like it had been locked away for too long. We've discovered something, Hayes said, his tone serious, almost grim. Something we weren't meant to find. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Alexander stepped forward, his instincts screaming at him to turn away, to walk back to his quarters and forget this entire nightmare. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when the mystery had already sunk so deep into his bones. Inside the docking bay stood a submersible, sleek, dark, its hull glinting under the harsh light. It was unlike any submersible Alexander had ever seen before. The design was advanced, its contours sharp and aggressive, like something out of a nightmare. The vessel was connected to the station's systems, a lifeline to the world beyond the steel walls of Abyss 3. But it wasn't just the submersible that caught Alexander's attention. It was the shadows surrounding it. The bay was cluttered with various equipment, but the shadows, they seemed wrong, out of place. They shifted in ways that shadows shouldn't. bending and twisting as if they were alive, as though they were part of the water itself. "Get in," Hayes commanded, snapping Alexander from his daze. "We're going down." "Down where?" Alexander asked, but Hayes didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the hatch of the submersible. It was clear that there was no room for questions. Whatever was happening, it was already in motion. Reluctantly, Alexander stepped inside. The interior was cramped, but functional. The glass viewport offered a view into the dark abyss, the endless ocean that stretched far beyond the station's reach. The water outside seemed black, a void without end. He could almost feel it pulling at him, beckoning him into its depths. Once they were inside, Hayes sealed the hatch, and the submersible hummed to life, the engines stirring with a low growl. The tension inside the vessel was palpable. Neither of them spoke as the submersible descended slowly, the light from the station fading until it was nothing more than a dim glow behind them. The darkness outside swallowed them whole. As they descended further into the abyss, Alexander couldn't help but feel the growing weight of the ocean pressing in from all sides. The pressure was unbearable, the silence deafening. There was nothing but the quiet hum of the submersible and the occasional creak of its frame. And then, the feeling came again. The presence. It was back. That unmistakable sensation of being watched. Only this time, it was different. It wasn't just the sense that something unseen was observing them. No, this time it felt as if the ocean itself had turned its gaze upon them, as if the water had grown sentient, as if something was down there, something ancient and terrible, waiting to emerge. Alexander's breath quickened, his palms sweating against the cool metal of the control panel. He turned to Hayes, but the other man was still, his eyes fixed on the viewport, a strange smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You feel it too, don't you?" Hayes said softly, his voice almost reverent. Alexander nodded, though his throat was tight. "What is it, Hayes? What did we come down here to find?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tapped a few buttons on the console, and the submersible's lights flickered. For a moment, the darkness outside seemed to thicken, like a liquid, viscous and alive. The lights flickered again, then stabilized. The deep ocean loomed outside, an endless void, stretching forever. And then, there it was, a shadow. At first, it was barely noticeable, a subtle distortion in the water. But it grew, and as it did, Alexander felt his heart lurch in his chest. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't anything that could be explained by science or reason. It was something else entirely. Something alive in a way that defied logic. The shadow seemed to writhe, shifting in the water, growing larger, more defined. It was coming closer. "This is what we've been searching for," Hayes said, his voice cold and empty of emotion. "The heart of the abyss." To be continued. This extended version of Chapter 3 builds upon the suspense, continuing the descent into the unknown. The presence of the strange entity intensifies, and the psychological tension between Alexander and Hayes deepens. The chapter explores more of the eerie, oppressive atmosphere of the station and the ocean that surrounds them, setting the stage for darker revelations. Let me know if you'd like to continue or develop this further. Chapter 4. The abyss beckons. The shadow outside the submersible seemed to pulse, stretching and retracting in the water like an enormous dark heart beating in the depths. Alexander Fedorov's breath caught in his throat as the silhouette took on a more distinct shape, something angular and strange, far larger than anything he had imagined. The ocean outside had never been more alive, more hostile. He pressed himself back against the seat, his mind screaming to turn around, to return to the relative safety of the station above. But the words had no power. The submersible continued its slow, inevitable descent. Hayes, sitting across from him, seemed disturbingly calm, as if this was all part of a grand design, a truth long ago accepted. His fingers moved across the console with mechanical precision, his eyes fixed on the shadow outside the viewport. He didn't seem afraid. He seemed almost pleased. "Do you see it, Fedorov?" Hayes's voice was low, almost reverential. Alexander nodded, though he couldn't find the words to respond. He could feel the presence, the oppressive weight of something ancient and unknowable pressing against the vessel. It was as though the very water itself was alive, suffocating, pulling them down deeper, deeper into the depths where no human had ever gone willingly. The shadow loomed closer, its edges growing sharper. At first, Alexander had hoped it was just an illusion, a trick of the light. But now, as the submersible drew nearer, the shape took on a more definitive form. It was massive, an impossibly large serpentine thing with spiny ridges and a long, undulating body that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the submersible's view. It moved through the water with eerie fluidity, its movements deliberate, as though it was hunting or waiting. Are we going to get closer to it? Alexander asked, his voice unsteady, though he didn't recognize it as his own. Hayes smiled, a cold, distant smile that barely reached his eyes. You don't understand yet, do you? This is what we've been searching for. This is why we're here. The words hit Alexander like a slap. What are you talking about? This thing, what is it? Hayes leaned forward, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the console. His expression softened, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of something resembling compassion in his eyes. It's a relic, Fedorov, an ancient entity, older than anything humanity has ever encountered. It was never meant to be found, but we are the ones who found it. The truth, however horrible, was starting to become clear to Alexander. He felt a sharp prickling at the back of his neck, a growing unease that had nothing to do with the creature outside and everything to do with the words Hayes was saying. Hayes had known. He'd known from the beginning what they were really here for, and it wasn't the scientific research that had been claimed as their purpose. This was no ordinary expedition. It was a hunt. They had been sent here to find the thing that lurked beneath, to make contact with something beyond human understanding. Alexander's heart thudded painfully in his chest. You knew about this, and you brought us all here to… what? To capture it? Hayes didn't answer. Instead, he reached over and activated a series of switches. A soft mechanical hum filled the submersible, and the lights inside flickered. The outside world, which had been a black, oppressive void, seemed to shimmer as the strange entity drew closer. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The submersible hovered motionless, and the vast, cavernous space outside felt more suffocating than ever before. The entity was no longer just a shape in the darkness. It was close enough now that Alexander could make out its features, its scales, its spiny tendrils, the glowing, unnatural light emanating from its body. It was beautiful in a horrific, otherworldly way, as though it belonged to a time before humans, before life itself had begun. Hayes reached into a compartment beside him and pulled out a small device, a remote of some kind, its purpose unclear. He didn't look at Alexander as he pressed a button on it, but the moment he did, the submersible's lights shifted from their dim, white glow to a haunting, blood-red hue. The ocean outside appeared to warp, like the very fabric of reality was bending around them. The creature, the thing, seemed to react, its glowing eyes narrowing, its body moving in a fluid motion that was almost hypnotic. It can feel us now, Hayes whispered. It knows we're here. Alexander's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles cracking under the pressure. He felt trapped, suffocated by the growing presence that seemed to infect every corner of the submersible. The air was thick with dread, with anticipation, as though something in the ocean wanted to rise up and swallow them whole. A voice at the back of his mind screamed at him to leave, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. "You're sure about this?" Alexander finally managed to rasp, his voice shaking, though he had already known the answer. It was too late. They were already in too deep. Hayes finally looked at him, a sharp, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. This is only the beginning. As if on cue, the ocean outside began to shift once more. The shadow, which had seemed to grow infinitely large, now began to recede, pulling back into the depths. But it wasn't retreating, it was luring them deeper. Alexander's heart beat faster as the submersible's lights flickered again, this time revealing an even greater expanse of blackness. Hayes looked pleased, almost satisfied. "Do you see it now? This is why we came. We were never meant to simply study it. We were meant to open the door, and now We've found the key. The words hung in the air like an incantation, an invocation to something ancient, something hungry. Alexander felt himself growing cold, his fingers trembling as he gripped the seat. Something about the way Hayes said it, the way he believed it, made his stomach twist with dread. The submersible began moving again, slowly, cautiously, as if the ocean itself were guiding them towards something. The sense of being watched intensified, suffocating in its weight. Alexander didn't dare to look outside again. The ocean was alive, and whatever was lurking down there was far worse than anything he could ever imagine. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a deep, unrelenting terror, the kind that no human should ever have to face. And yet, they were here, they were in it. For the first time in his life, Alexander understood the true meaning of the word insanity. To gaze into the abyss was one thing. To be pulled into it, to be made a part of it, was something else entirely. Suddenly, the submersible lurched forward, its engines roaring to life. The light outside was now swallowed by an unnatural blackness, an infinite sea that stretched beyond comprehension. Amagi, ought to be continued. In this chapter, the psychological tension between Alexander and Hayes escalates as they delve deeper into the oceanic abyss. The presence of the ancient creature becomes more pronounced, its influence growing as they get closer. The unsettling revelations about the true purpose of their mission continue to haunt Alexander, setting the stage for more terrifying developments in the chapters to come. Let me know if you would like to continue further, or if there's a specific direction you'd like to take the story in. Chapter 5. The Awakening. The silence was unbearable. Alexander sat in the submersible, his heart hammering in his chest as he listened to the faint hum of the failing systems around him. The darkness outside the small cabin pressed in, suffocating him, the inky abyss that surrounded them stretching out endlessly in all directions. He could feel the weight of the ocean pushing against the hull, the pressure building with every passing moment. He wasn't sure how long it had been since the lights had gone out. Hours, days. Time no longer made sense. It was like the submersible had become a tomb that was sinking deeper and deeper into the ocean's grasp. A tomb that was slowly being claimed by something far older, far more malevolent than anything he could have imagined. He turned his gaze to Hayes, who sat across from him. The man had been silent for hours, his face a pale, hollow mask of fear. The once proud scientist had been reduced to a trembling wreck, his eyes wide with terror, his body hunched as though trying to shrink away from something invisible. "Hayes," Alexander whispered, his voice trembling. "What happened to you? What happened to all of us?" Hayes didn't respond. His eyes were locked onto the darkness outside, as if he could see something there, something no one else could. Alexander had tried to reach him, tried to snap him out of whatever trance he had fallen into, but nothing worked. Hayes was beyond reach, beyond reason. And then, the tapping came again. It was soft at first, just a faint sound, like the tapping of fingers against the hull. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more insistent, more rhythmic. Alexander's heart skipped a beat as he stood up, his legs shaky beneath him. He approached the viewport, pressing his hand against the cold glass, his breath fogging it up. What was it? What was making that sound? The tapping continued, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was heavy, oppressive, like the stillness that follows the strike of a lightning bolt, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Alexander turned to Hayes, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. But Hayes didn't move. He didn't even blink. Something was wrong. Alexander's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for something, anything, that might explain what was happening. He noticed, for the first time, the faint shimmer in the air, like a distortion, an unnatural ripple. It was as though the very space around him was warping, stretching, bending. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. He had been taught to believe in science, in logic, in the belief that everything had an explanation, a reason, a cause. But there was no explanation for this. A cold wind blew through the cabin, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of salt and decay. Alexander's skin prickled as the temperature dropped, the air around him thickening. He stepped back from the viewport, his breath coming faster, his pulse quickening. And then he saw it. A shadow moved outside the submersible, a dark mass shifting through the water. It was enormous. Something vast and incomprehensible. Far too large to belong to any creature that should exist in the depths of the ocean. It passed by the viewport, blocking out the faint light that filtered through the darkness, casting a long, sinister shadow on the walls of the cabin. Alexander's heart stopped. He couldn't breathe. His eyes were locked on the shadow, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. What was it? What was out there? The shadow moved again, sliding across the hull like something alive, something sentient. It wasn't just the size of it that terrified him. It was the presence of it, the sheer, undeniable presence. Something ancient, something hungry. The tapping came again, this time louder, more insistent. Alexander pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the sound. It was inside his head now, a rhythmic drumbeat of terror, filling his mind with a growing sense of dread. And then he heard a voice. It was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. A voice, human, but distorted, like a ghost trapped in a nightmare. "Help me." Alexander froze. His heart pounded in his chest. The voice was so real, so clear. It was right there, as though someone was standing beside him, breathing into his ear. But there was no one there. There was only the silence and the dark. "Help me." The voice was pleading now, desperate, as if whatever was speaking knew that it was about to be consumed by something far worse. The words sent a shiver down Alexander's spine, and he turned to Hayes, his throat tight. "Hayes, did you hear that?" he asked. But Hayes just stared blankly at him, his eyes vacant. The man was lost. The voice, whatever it was, had taken him too. The tapping grew louder, faster, a constant rhythm, a countdown to something. The pressure in the submersible increased, the walls groaning under the strain. Alexander could feel it now, the weight of the ocean pressing in on them, pushing against them, pulling at them with invisible hands. The shadow moved again, and this time it was closer, much closer. Alexander's breath hitched as he stepped back, his hands trembling. He could see it now, just outside the viewport, a shape, impossibly large, like a vast, blackened creature, its form shifting and undulating in the water. He couldn't make out its true shape, but the feeling of it was undeniable. It was there, watching, waiting, and then the voice spoke again. "Come closer." Alexander's blood ran cold. The voice was different this time, more insistent, more commanding. It wasn't asking for help anymore. It was giving an order. "Come closer." The shadow outside the submersible shifted again, and this time, it didn't disappear. It pressed against the hull, pushing against it with a force that made the entire vessel shudder. The tapping turned into a rhythmic pounding, a drumbeat of doom, as if something was trying to break through, to force its way inside. Alexander stumbled backward, his mind reeling. What was this thing? What was it? He couldn't understand it. It was too much. His thoughts were fragmented, like pieces of glass scattered on the floor, impossible to put back together. He reached for the controls, his hands shaking, desperate to do something, anything. The submersible was slipping deeper into the abyss, sinking into the unknown, and there was no way out, no way to escape. The tapping stopped, replaced by a deep rumbling sound, like the growl of a predator waiting to pounce. And then there was a crash. The hull buckled under the force of something heavy, something powerful. The submersible lurched violently, throwing Alexander against the wall, his head slamming into the cold metal. Everything went dark. To be continued. This version of Chapter 5 continues to expand on the eerie atmosphere, layering in unsettling imagery and focusing on the psychological deterioration of the characters. The pacing slows down, building the tension, and hints at the horror lurking just outside the submersible. If you'd like to further develop any specific part or adjust the direction, feel free to let me know. Chapter 6. The Heart of the Abyss. The silence was unbearable. It pressed against Alexander's chest, a weight too heavy for him to bear. He could feel the air thickening, as though the submersible itself was shrinking, drawing him closer to the suffocating depths of the ocean outside. The rhythmic hum of the engines had long since stopped, replaced by a disturbing stillness that seemed to seep into every corner of the vessel. The viewport in front of him was his only connection to the outside world, or what remained of it. The glass was cold to the touch, and the darkness beyond it was like a living thing, crawling over the edges, stretching out into an infinite void. What lay out there was more than just the deep, more than the ocean. It was something ancient, something forgotten, something that had been waiting for the right moment to wake up. Hayes had fallen silent beside him, his once familiar presence now a distant, cold thing. The man had been transformed, as if the very journey itself had hollowed him out, piece by piece, until only a shell of his former self remained. His eyes were vacant, staring into the depths with a strange intensity, and his lips were drawn into a faint, unsettling smile. It was the smile of a man who had seen something that could never be unseen, something that had shattered his mind and left him a broken shell. "Hayes," Alexander said, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't know why he even bothered anymore. There was no response, not even a flicker of recognition in Hayes's eyes. He was gone. Whatever had taken hold of him had consumed him completely. Alexander turned back to the viewport, trying to focus, trying to steady his shaking hands. There had to be something he could do, some way to fix this, to get them out of here. The submersible was supposed to withstand the pressure of the ocean's depths, wasn't it? But now, it felt like it was closing in on him, its metal walls groaning under the strain, as though something from outside was pushing against them, testing their limits. Suddenly, there was a noise, a soft tapping, almost imperceptible, like a gentle knock against the hull. Alexander's heart stopped. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Could it be an animal, a passing current? Or was it something else, something far worse? The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was rhythmic now, deliberate. It wasn't just the sound of something moving. It was the sound of something alive, something sentient, something that knew they were here, knew they were listening. "Do you hear that?" Alexander's voice cracked as he turned to Hayes, but Hayes didn't move. The man's expression was still vacant, lost in a trance of some sort, as if he were already beyond the reach of the living. The tapping came again, louder this time, followed by a low rumble that vibrated through the hull, sending a shiver down Alexander's spine. Whatever it was huge, immense, and it was close. Too close. A dark shadow passed in front of the viewport, blocking out the faint light that filtered through the submersible's exterior. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he could barely hear the sound of his own thoughts. There it was, a massive, indistinct shape, moving with terrifying purpose. It was hard to make out its form, but Alexander could feel it, could sense its presence like a storm on the horizon, darkening the world around him. It was something vast, something far larger than anything that should exist in the depths of the ocean. The shape moved again, sliding slowly across the glass, like some great leviathan. Alexander's hand shot out, pressing against the viewport, his palms slick with sweat. He leaned closer, his breath fogging up the glass, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. But the shadow disappeared just as quickly as it had come, leaving only the oppressive darkness in its wake. No, he wasn't imagining it. Something was out there, something far beyond the reaches of human understanding. His mind raced. What was it? How could it have been waiting out there, in the cold, in the dark for so long? And why now? What was it waiting for? Suddenly, the submersible jerked violently, throwing Alexander against the wall. The lights flickered, casting fleeting shadows that danced along the walls like ghosts. A loud, guttural sound echoed through the vessel, something between a growl and a roar, and the submersible lurched again, this time with even more force. The metal groaned, and Alexander could hear the hull straining against the pressure, the weight of the ocean pushing in from all sides. It wasn't just the pressure of the water. There was something else, something unseen, something alive, pushing against them. It was as though the very ocean had become a living, breathing entity, trying to claim them as its own. The submersible shook again, harder this time, and the lights flickered one last time before going out completely. Darkness enveloped them, absolute and suffocating. Alexander was left alone in the dark, his only source of comfort the faint hum of the emergency power systems, the low, almost imperceptible sound that told him they were still alive. For now, but that was no consolation. Not anymore. In the pitch-black silence, Alexander's senses heightened. He could feel the weight of the ocean pressing against them, the crushing cold, the infinite blackness that stretched out beyond the small confines of the submersible. It felt like the world itself had fallen away, like they were floating in an endless abyss, surrounded by nothing but the suffocating dark. A soft whisper broke the silence. "Help me!" The voice was faint, barely audible, like a breath in the wind. Alexander froze, his heart skipping a beat. Was it Hayes? Was it his own mind playing tricks on him? He turned to look at Hayes, but the man remained motionless, his face as blank and expressionless as ever. There was no movement, no indication that Hayes had spoken, but the voice had been so real, so clear. It came again, a little louder this time. "Help me!" Alexander's blood ran cold. The voice was not Hayes. It wasn't his imagination either. It was something else, something inside the submersible. He stumbled to his feet, his hands trembling as he groped in the dark for anything that might offer him an explanation, a way out. But there was nothing. Nothing except the faint pulse of the emergency lights, barely enough to illuminate the edges of the cabin, casting long, grotesque shadows on the walls. And then he saw it. At the far end of the cabin, just beyond the reach of the emergency light, a shape moved. It was a figure, human, or at least it looked human at first glance, but there was something wrong about it. Its movements were slow, unnaturally so, like a puppet on broken strings. Its face was obscured by darkness, but there was no mistaking the terrible sense of wrongness that hung in the air around it. "Who's there?" Alexander whispered, his voice barely a breath. He was trembling now, unable to stop the wave of terror that washed over him. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest, but the figure didn't move. It stood motionless like a statue. Then suddenly, it turned, and Alexander saw the face. It was not Hayes. It was not anyone he recognized. It was a face, but it was wrong, twisted, as if reality itself had been bent and warped. The skin was pale, stretched too tightly over the bones, the eyes wide and black, staring through him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, but there was no humor in it, no joy, just a silent, unfathomable malice. "Help me," it whispered again, and this time, Alexander knew that it wasn't asking for help at all. It was giving him a command, and as the darkness around him thickened, he realized something. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Something had come from the abyss, and it was hungry. To be continued. For in this rewritten chapter, I've expanded the psychological horror elements, focusing on Alexander's descent into panic and paranoia. The atmosphere is thick with tension, as the submersible becomes more of a trap than a vessel. Let me know if you'd like further changes or expansions on any specific aspects. Chapter 7. The Descent into Madness. Alexander sat in the pilot's seat, his back stiff and eyes glazed, staring at the dim emergency lights that flickered above him. The entire submersible creaked and groaned in protest as the pressure of the ocean pressed down upon it. It felt as though the very sea itself were alive, and it was trying to crush them, slowly, relentlessly. His thoughts were fogged, a haze of exhaustion and confusion. How long had it been since they descended into these depths? Hours? Days? Time had ceased to have meaning down here, surrounded by nothing but the oppressive dark and the crushing silence of the abyss. The weight of the ocean pressed against him, the silence amplifying his every thought until they were indistinguishable from the maddening hum of the submersible's failing systems. Beside him, Hayes sat, his form slumped in the corner. The man hadn't spoken in what seemed like an eternity, but that didn't surprise Alexander. Everyone who entered these depths went mad. They had all been warned, but they had come anyway. The promise of riches, the thrill of discovery. It was all too tempting for those who didn't understand the true cost of venturing into the void. And now, Hayes was beyond saving. Alexander had been checking the systems for hours. The submersible was falling apart. The oxygen supply was dwindling. The communication systems had long since failed, and the emergency lights were the only thing left keeping the crushing darkness at bay. There was no way out. The surface was miles above them. No one could hear them, and they were too far from civilization to expect any rescue. No, this was it. This was the end. He reached for the controls again, the cold metal biting into his fingertips as he desperately tried to restore some semblance of life to the submersible. His heart pounded, sweat beading on his forehead. But no matter what he did, the systems continued to fail, flickering in and out like a dying star. It was as though the very craft were alive and choosing to surrender. It was at that moment that the tapping began, a faint sound at first, almost imperceptible against the groaning of the submersible, but it was there, unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and seemed to come from somewhere deep beneath them. Alexander's hand froze over the controls. He had heard that sound before, back in the research facility, when they had first descended to this God-forsaken depth. It was the sound of something, waiting. His breath caught in his throat, and he looked over at Hayes, half expecting the man to jump up in terror, but Hayes remained slumped in his corner, his body unnaturally still, as if frozen in place. Alexander turned back to the viewport, his eyes scanning the inky blackness outside, but all he saw was the endless dark. There was nothing out there, nothing except the tapping. He swallowed hard, trying to ignore the pounding in his chest, the cold sweat that soaked his shirt. It's nothing, he told himself, just the submersible, just the pressure, bending the metal. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie. The tapping was too precise, too rhythmic. It was too deliberate to be the result of some mechanical malfunction. Something was out there. Something was watching them. Tap, tap, tap. The noise seemed to be coming closer now, echoing through the walls of the submersible. Alexander could hear it reverberating in his bones, like a distant heartbeat, slow, steady, and filled with menace. He pressed his palm to the viewport, his eyes straining to see beyond the murky glass. But all he could make out was the swirling, empty void of the ocean. There was nothing but the blackness, nothing but the sound of the tapping. It was louder now. The walls of the submersible seemed to vibrate under the rhythmic pressure. The sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. There was no question now. It was coming from the outside. Something was knocking at the hull. Something huge. Something with purpose. Alexander backed away from the viewport, his pulse pounding in his ears as his mind raced. He felt a rush of panic rise up in him, cold and bitter. This isn't real, he tried to tell himself. This is just the pressure, the ocean playing tricks on me. But deep down, he knew it wasn't true. The tapping was something more, something far more sinister. He glanced at Hayes again, but still, the man didn't stir. Alexander's heart sank. Hayes had completely withdrawn, his eyes blank, staring at nothing. He looked like a corpse, though the man was still breathing, just barely. Alexander staggered toward the control panel, his hands shaking as he gripped the levers and switches, trying to get any kind of response from the submersible. But the tapping continued, louder now, accompanied by a strange sound, like a low hum, a vibration that rattled the walls of the craft. The submersible groaned in protest as the hum grew deeper, more guttural, like the growl of some colossal beast. The lights flickered. For a moment, everything was dark, and Alexander's breath hitched in his throat. The world seemed to go still, like a vacuum. Then the lights sputtered back to life, casting harsh shadows that flickered across the walls, distorting the shapes around him. The tapping was no longer rhythmic. It was frantic, chaotic, as though the thing outside was in a frenzy, desperate to get inside. It's coming, Alexander thought, his stomach churning. It's coming for us. He turned back to the viewport, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges, peering into the depths, desperate to see what was out there. The sea beyond was still, its inky blackness stretching on forever. But then, just as his mind started to spin with dread, he saw it, a shape. It was huge, massive. It loomed just at the edge of the viewport, its form impossible to make out completely. But Alexander could see the outline. A long, serpentine body, twisting and turning like a snake in the water. It was enormous, far larger than anything he could comprehend, and it was moving toward them, its massive form drawing closer with every passing second. The tapping stopped. There was silence. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the air grow colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, and then a voice. No, not a voice. A presence pressed against his mind. "Come to me," the voice whispered. Its words sent through his skull like a jolt of electricity. It was deep, guttural, and unearthly, resonating with the very core of his being. The voice was not just heard, it was felt. It was like a ripple in the water, a vibration that stirred something ancient and forgotten deep within his subconscious. "Come closer," it beckoned again. Alexander stumbled back, his mind reeling, panic gripping him. His legs were weak, his body trembling, and he could feel his thoughts slipping away from him. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But the tapping began again, louder, faster, more frantic. He turned, stumbling toward the back of the submersible, desperate to escape, to get away from the thing outside. But there was no escape. There was no way out. The thing was out there, watching him, calling to him. "Come closer." The lights flickered again, casting strange, dancing shadows across the cabin. The tapping was deafening now, a pounding rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The submersible began to shake violently, the metal creaking under the pressure, as though the creature outside was testing the hull, trying to force its way inside. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It pressed in on him, suffocating, filling every corner of the submersible, drowning him in an oppressive darkness. Alexander's eyes darted around, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound, only the dead, suffocating silence. But something was wrong. Something was waiting, and it would not be ignored. This expansion delves deeper into the psychological horror, amplifying Alexander's growing sense of madness and the mystery of the creature outside. The tapping sound serves as a device to drive him further into paranoia and dread, creating an unsettling atmosphere of isolation. The tension builds, leading to a sense of impending doom as the protagonist faces something far beyond his comprehension. Let me know if you'd like further expansions or revisions. Chapter 8. The Abyss. Stares back. The deep was unforgiving. A vast, unyielding expanse that stretched far beyond anything human eyes could comprehend. Alexander had always known the ocean was a place of mystery, a place where the unknown reigned. But this was something entirely different, something darker, something ancient. The submersible had been descending for what felt like days. The time was irrelevant now, swallowed by the depths of the abyss. Alexander's mind was slipping, every waking moment growing more surreal, like the ocean was draining away his very sense of reality. The suffocating pressure outside was mirrored by the relentless pressure inside. His thoughts, his memories, even his soul seemed to be slowly, inexorably crushed under an invisible weight. The lights flickered in the cabin, casting eerie shadows against the walls. The low hum of the submersible's engines was the only sound, but it was becoming increasingly warped, as if the very air inside was growing heavier. The tapping from outside had stopped, but Alexander could feel it still, an oppressive presence, unseen, but ever present, lurking just beyond the small windows of the submersible. He tried to shake the feeling, to focus on something, anything, but his mind felt like it was being pulled in 1,000 different directions. The small screens in front of him displayed garbled readings, their numbers dancing like a code he couldn't understand. The ocean around them seemed to mock him, so vast, so endless. There was no way out. There was no escape. The air was stale now, thin, and it tasted of metal and salt. His skin crawled, and his breath was ragged as he forced himself to check the instruments once again. The oxygen level was dipping. The temperature was plummeting. The pressure outside was becoming unbearable. Each creak and groan of the submersible seemed to shake him to the core. A shudder ran through the vessel, and for a moment, Alexander froze, his heart lurching in his chest. Had something hit them? Or was it just his imagination? He turned to look at Hayes, but the man remained motionless in the corner of the cabin, his eyes wide open but unseeing, like a corpse that had been left behind. The submersible shook again, harder this time, and Alexander grabbed the controls, trying to steady himself. His mind raced. Was it the creature from before? Had it followed them deeper into the abyss? Or was there something else? Something older? Something bigger lurking in the darkness? It had been so silent since the tapping had stopped. The stillness was unbearable, but in that silence, something else had begun to grow. A pressure in the air that was almost physical, as though the very space around him had become dense, suffocating. The darkness outside pressed in, as though it was alive, trying to consume the vessel. And then the whispers started, low at first, like the wind through a cave, but growing louder with each passing second. Alexander's breath quickened. He stood up, his hand clutching the sides of the console. The whispers were incomprehensible, an unintelligible murmur that scratched at the edges of his mind. It was as though the sound was trying to claw its way into his thoughts, to invade his very consciousness. "You can hear us," the voice whispered, the words piercing through his mind like a blade. "You are not alone." Alexander's skin went cold. He stumbled back, his hand flying to the emergency shutoff, but the whispers only grew louder, swirling around him in the cabin, filling every inch of the submersible. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat like a drum, deafening in the sudden silence that followed. "We are here," the voice continued, now clearer, more distinct. "We are the ones who have been waiting for you." Alexander tried to cover his ears to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voice was inside him now, worming its way into his mind, filling every gap, every corner. It felt ancient, impossibly old, like it had been waiting for millennia to make itself heard. The words didn't just fill his ears, they invaded him. "You are the key," the voice whispered, almost tenderly, as if it were speaking directly to his very soul. "You were always the key." He spun around, his eyes wide, his mind racing to comprehend what was happening. The whispers continued, circling in his mind, pushing him to the edge of madness. Something was here, something that had always been here, hidden in the ocean's depths. Something older than time, older than man, waiting in the black void of the ocean. The darkness outside seemed to respond. The blackness in the viewport shifted, as though it were alive. The light from the submersible was swallowed whole, the vast expanse of the deep ocean drawing everything into its maw. The windows of the submersible blurred, distorting, until Alexander could no longer make out the shapes in the abyss. They were fading. No, they were approaching. Something was coming. A shape. No, not a shape. A presence, larger than anything Alexander could have imagined, began to emerge from the deep. It loomed just beyond the reach of the small lights from the submersible, an immense mass that stretched on and on, its form defying all comprehension. It was not like anything living. It was a thing of darkness, an entity forged from the very fabric of the ocean, its movements too slow, too deliberate to be anything alive. His breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled on the controls. This was it. This was the thing that had been waiting for them. The whispers turned into a single unified voice, a chorus of ancient broken voices that filled his mind with their presence, their hunger. "You belong to us now," the voice said. And as the words slipped into his ears, they were followed by a strange, unnatural vibration, like the beating of a great heart. The submersible shuddered violently, and for a moment, Alexander feared it would be torn apart by the force of whatever was outside. Then came the sound that he would never forget, a deep, guttural noise that reverberated through the walls of the vessel, a low, growling hum that shook the very bones of his body. It wasn't just a noise. It was a presence, a living, breathing thing that was coming for him. In that moment, he knew it was too late. There was no escape, no hope. The whispers grew louder, the sound of the creature outside swelling with each passing second. Alexander stumbled back, his vision blurring, his mind unraveling. His eyes darted wildly around the cabin, but there was no place to hide. There was no place left to run. The presence was everywhere. "You belong to us now," The voices echoed one last time, and with that, the lights flickered for the final time. The last thing Alexander heard before everything went black was the sound of something enormous, something incomprehensible, pressing against the hull of the submersible. The end had come, and in the eternal silence of the deep, the ocean consumed all. This expanded Chapter 8 continues to build the atmosphere of paranoia and dread as Alexander is consumed by the ocean's haunting presence. The psychological tension heightens, and the supernatural force that has been lurking in the depths is revealed in full, leaving the protagonist helpless against the inevitability of the abyss. If you'd like any further revisions or additional content, feel free to ask. Chapter 9. The Price of Silence. The submersible drifted through the black abyss of the ocean, a tiny speck in an unfathomable expanse. The pressure outside was unbearable, the crushing weight of the ocean pressing against the fragile vessel with a relentless, insistent force. But inside, the world had gone eerily quiet. Alexander's breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning for air. But it wasn't the oxygen in the cabin he was struggling for. It was something deeper, something more primal. The silence outside had seeped into him, an oppressive quiet that clung to his skin, settled into his bones. He was becoming one with it. A part of the darkness that surrounded him, the nothingness that stretched out, infinite and unknowable. The lights in the submersible flickered again. They had been doing that more often lately, as though the power itself was waning, but Alexander wasn't concerned. The lights had been flickering ever since they first descended, as if the vessel itself was slowly giving in to the ocean's cold embrace. He stared out of the viewport into the pitch-black void. At first, all he could see was the faintest glimmer of bioluminescence in the distance. Tiny flickering flashes that looked like stars scattered across an ocean of ink. But the glow was inconsistent, irregular, like some broken pulse that staggered in and out of sight. That light isn't real, he thought. It's just the after-images of my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the darkness, it's messing with me. But even as he tried to convince himself of that, something inside him stirred, a gnawing, hollow feeling in the pit of his stomach that told him he was wrong. The light wasn't a trick. It was something far deeper than he could comprehend. Against his better judgment, Alexander's fingers moved toward the control panel. He didn't want to move closer to it. He knew that, but his body was moving as if it had a mind of its own. His hand hovered over the joystick, as if it was compelled to push him toward that faint, distant glow. His mind screamed at him to turn back, to escape the pull of whatever force was drawing him in, but his body ignored it. His thoughts no longer seemed to belong to him. He was being controlled, guided by something outside of himself. He pressed the throttle, and the submersible slowly began to move. The eerie hum of the submersible's engines vibrated through the cabin. It was the only sound that broke the silence, and even that seemed wrong, warped in some way, like it was coming from a place far beneath them. The walls of the vessel seemed to groan, as if protesting the movement. The hum intensified, reverberating through Alexander's skull, vibrating in the very marrow of his bones. The light grew brighter as they moved deeper into the unknown. It pulsed rhythmically, like the beating of some great invisible heart. Alexander couldn't look away. He was transfixed by it, as if it had reached into his very soul and ensnared him. The glow was unnatural, an unsettling shade of green, almost toxic in its hue. It wasn't the kind of light that should exist in the pitch-black depths of the ocean. It felt alien, like it had no place here in the cold, unfeeling dark. The pressure around him seemed to increase, pressing against the hull of the submersible with a heavy, oppressive force. The deeper they went, the more the air inside the cabin seemed to thicken, as though the very atmosphere was becoming heavier. The oxygen felt thinner, harder to breathe, and Alexander's chest tightened with each passing second. His vision swam, his head spinning. His mind was pulling apart at the seams, and he could feel it. Something was inside him. Something was crawling through his thoughts, burrowing into his consciousness, twisting and warping his perception of reality. It's the light, he thought, panic creeping into his veins. It's affecting me. It's messing with my mind. The light in the distance seemed to grow even brighter, the pulse quickening as though it was reacting to his fear. It called to him, drawing him in. The walls of the submersible flickered, the shadows dancing in strange patterns as the hum grew louder, deeper. It felt like the very walls of reality were beginning to bend, like the universe was stretching, expanding, about to collapse in on itself. He could feel it now, the presence. It wasn't something physical. It wasn't something he could touch or see with his eyes. But it was there, watching him, waiting. It had always been there, lurking in the depths of the ocean, in the vast emptiness, patient, knowing that he would come. He had come to it. They had all come to it. Alexander's heart hammered in his chest, his body trembling with an adrenaline he couldn't control. He gripped the controls tightly, knuckles white, but his mind was elsewhere, somewhere far beyond the submersible, beyond the ocean, beyond the very fabric of space and time. He could hear the whispers again, the soft murmurs that had followed him ever since he had descended into this forsaken abyss. "You are not alone," the voice whispered, a familiar guttural sound that clawed at the edges of his mind. It was a voice he had heard before, but he couldn't place it. The words were simple, but they carried a weight, an overwhelming certainty. "You have never been alone." His body froze. The voice didn't come from outside the submersible. It wasn't the radio. It wasn't even his own mind. It was something else, something far more ancient, more terrifying. It was in him, inside him, burrowing into the core of his existence. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat. No words came. His body had betrayed him. "Don't look," he thought, but his eyes were already drawn to the viewport. The light outside had taken on a form. No longer just a pulsing glow, it had coalesced into something more tangible. Something alive. It was a shape, but not a shape that should exist. It was ever shifting, twisting in on itself like some great writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, stretching endlessly, moving like liquid through a broken, fractured reality. The glow from it was too much, too blinding, too unnatural, bending the light around it, distorting everything. And then, with a sickening lurch, the presence moved. It surged forward, a tidal wave of darkness and light, engulfing the submersible. The viewport cracked, the glass warping under the pressure, and Alexander could feel the hum grow deafening in his skull. The thing outside wasn't just looking at him anymore. It was inside him, in his mind, in his thoughts, in his very soul. "We are the ones who created you," it said. And this time, the voice wasn't just whispering. It was roaring in his head, an avalanche of sound that drowned out everything else. "We are the deep." The light flared violently, brighter than any star, brighter than the sun. It consumed him, blinded him. His vision went white, and then everything exploded. End of Chapter 9. This expanded version of Chapter 9 aims to increase the psychological tension and horror. The protagonist, Alexander, struggles against the suffocating presence of the mysterious force in the ocean, and the horrors he faces become both internal and external. The blurring of reality, the confusion, and the escalating terror are all key elements in heightening the intensity of this chapter. Let me know if you'd like further expansion or changes to the story. Chapter 10. The Depths of the Unknowable. Extended. The silence in the submersible was all-encompassing, and yet Alexander could not escape the sensation that he was no longer truly alone. His mind was a swirling vortex of confusion, panic, and despair. The low hum of the engines, once a comforting presence, had now vanished completely, leaving him in a vacuum of isolation. He tried to focus on the control panel, but the words on the screens were blurring before his eyes, their meaning slipping away like sand through his fingers. What's happening? His hands were slick with sweat, his breath shallow and ragged, as though he had just run a marathon in the dark. The very air around him felt thick, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. He leaned forward in the seat, gripping the edges of the control panel, his fingers trembling with the strain. For a moment, there was nothing but the oppressive weight of silence. And then, something shifted. The submersible shuddered violently, as if something had struck it from the outside, something large, something monstrous. The metal groaned in protest, vibrating beneath him, sending a jolt of panic through his spine. His breath caught in his throat, his heart skipping a beat as his mind struggled to comprehend the sensation. No, 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 he thought desperately. Not now, please, not now. He scrambled to his feet, his body unsteady, his legs weak from the tension that had built up in his muscles. He stumbled over to the viewport, his breath fogging up the glass as he pressed his palms flat against it, eyes straining to see through the thick darkness. At first, there was nothing, just the black, endless abyss of the ocean. The kind of darkness that felt alive, as though it was watching him, waiting for him to make the slightest misstep. The water was still, and for a fleeting moment, Alexander thought he could hear nothing but the sound of his own racing heartbeat. Then, a flash, a shimmer in the distance, a flicker of something that didn't belong. The light was faint at first, just a subtle glimmer in the deep, too far to make out any clear shape or form. But the longer he stared at it, the more his pulse quickened, as the shimmer intensified, becoming a glowing shape in the blackened void. It was like a beacon, pulsing with a strange, hypnotic rhythm, but there was something off about it, something wrong. He leaned closer to the glass, squinting, his breath shallow. His eyes burned from staring too long into the darkness, but he couldn't tear himself away. The flickering light moved closer, growing larger, more defined, until it was unmistakable. A silhouette, a figure. It stood there in the depths, just out of reach, its shape shifting and undulating in ways that defied logic, as though it were both solid and formless at the same time. It was like watching smoke in the water, twisting and writhing in patterns that made his stomach churn. The figure was tall, humanoid, but not quite human. The proportions were wrong. The limbs seemed too long, too thin. The features were hidden beneath the shifting mass, but it radiated a cold, malevolent presence. The thing's movements were slow, deliberate, like it was drawing closer with a purpose. And yet, it did not swim. It floated. It was as though gravity had no hold on it. Alexander felt his chest tighten as he watched it approach. It was coming for him. Suddenly, the lights of the submersible flickered, sparking and dimming, and for a split second, the figure seemed to vanish. His heart skipped a beat as the cabin was plunged into darkness, leaving only the faintest traces of light emanating from the distant abyss. The silence was deafening, and then, whispers. Soft, indistinct at first, like 1,000 voices carried on the wind. But there was no wind. The voices were inside his head. No longer distant murmurs, but sharp, insistent whispers, each one gnawing at his sanity. It was as though the walls of the submersible were closing in on him, compressing his mind, forcing him to listen. "You're not alone," the voice whispered. "You never were." Alexander's breath hitched. He turned, frantic, looking for the source of the voice. There was nothing, nothing but the cold, empty metal of the submersible. But the voice, he could feel it, could hear it, vibrating in his skull. "It knows you," it continued. "It knows all of us. There is no escaping." The words were poison, sinking into his mind like a virus. He could feel the edges of his reality beginning to fray, his thoughts no longer his own, drifting away from him like fragments of a forgotten dream. His skin prickled with a sensation that was both foreign and terrifyingly familiar, and then it came again. The figure, now closer, much closer. Alexander stumbled backward, his breath ragged, his body shaking. He could no longer deny the truth. He wasn't hallucinating. This wasn't some fever dream. Whatever was outside the submersible was real, and it was here. The silhouette was now right in front of him, mere inches from the viewport. The figure seemed to lean toward him, its form twisting as it pressed against the glass. It was not a face he saw. There were no eyes, no features to speak of. But there was a presence, a weight behind its shape, as though it were looking straight into him. "You have seen the truth now," the voice whispered again. But this time it was no longer coming from the outside. It was in his mind. It was inside him. "And now, you are ours." His body felt like it was breaking apart, like his very bones were being compressed under the weight of the words. He clawed at his own head, trying to shut out the voice, the presence. But it was too strong. It was everywhere. It had always been here. A sharp, guttural sound broke through the silence, a sound that made Alexander's blood run cold. It was the sound of something, scratching against the submersible's hull. His eyes widened, his heart racing in his chest as he stumbled back from the viewport. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like the claws of some beast desperate to get inside. The submersible rocked again, more violently this time, the metal groaning in protest. Alexander stumbled and fell to the ground, his hand desperately reaching for the controls. But they no longer felt like they belonged to him. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to distort, warping and twisting in unnatural ways. No! The submersible shook once more, harder this time, and Alexander could hear the sound of something scraping across the metal, moving closer, inch by inch. He pressed his hands against his ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was inside him, vibrating through his skull, filling him with an unbearable pressure. "It's here," the voice echoed, the words reverberating like a bell in his mind. "It was always here. It was waiting for you." A light flashed in front of him, a blinding, searing light that filled the submersible, leaving no room for anything else. The darkness receded, and for a moment he thought he had gone blind. His heart hammered in his chest, the air thick with the scent of ozone. The light flickered again, and in its wake he saw it. The figure. Only this time, it was no longer outside. It was inside. End of Chapter 10. This extended version of Chapter 10 elaborates on Alexander's torment, amplifying the terror, the blurring of reality, and his inability to escape the otherworldly force that seems to be drawing him deeper into madness. The isolation, psychological horror, and claustrophobic atmosphere are enhanced, leading to the terrifying realization that the figure is no longer just an external presence, but something that has infiltrated the submersible itself. Final words. The submersible lurched one last time, its walls buckling under the unseen pressure that had been building for what felt like an eternity. Alexander's mind, frayed and splintered by the horrors he had witnessed, hung by the thinnest thread. The shape, the figure, was inside, and there was no longer any distinction between what was real and what was imagined. It had seeped into his very being, like poison in his veins, twisting his perception and distorting the world around him. There was no escaping it now. He gasped for breath, his chest tight with fear, but the air felt thick, suffocating. The whispers had become a constant presence in his mind, an insistent, suffocating chant. They no longer spoke in words, but in emotions, in sensations. Fear, despair, helplessness. The voice no longer needed to speak. It had become him. The lights flickered one final time, casting the cabin into an oppressive darkness. The world outside the viewport had faded into the abyss, and now there was only silence, a silence so deep that it felt as though the ocean itself had swallowed him whole. Time no longer made sense. Minutes felt like hours, hours felt like seconds, and all that remained was the overwhelming sense of being lost, of being consumed by something ancient and unknowable. But deep in the pit of his stomach, Alexander knew the truth. He had always known it, even when the whispers were faint, when the figure was a distant silhouette in the depths. The truth had always been there, buried beneath the layers of fear and denial. He was never meant to escape. The moment he had descended into this cursed abyss, he had already sealed his fate. This was no accident. The project, the research, the discovery, they were never meant to save humanity. They were never meant to advance science. No, this was something far older, far darker. This was something that had been waiting, lying in wait, biding its time until it found a vessel, until it found him. He had been chosen. Not because of his skill or his intellect, but because his mind was fragile enough to crack open, to allow the darkness to seep in. The walls of the submersible seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, breathing with the rhythm of the ocean. A low hum reverberated through the metal, vibrating in the marrow of his bones. His heart beat in sync with it, each thump a reminder of his impending doom. Alexander looked up at the viewport again, but this time he did not see the figure. Instead, he saw only the vast, infinite ocean, stretching out into nothingness. The water was black, unnaturally so, its depths seeming to go on forever. The darkness reached into him, pulling at his soul, as if the ocean itself was alive, hungry for his spirit. And then, as his mind began to unravel completely, he felt it, a presence behind him, a coldness that was not just physical, but spiritual. It pressed down on him, suffocating him from all sides. He could hear his own breath, shallow and rapid, but it sounded distant, like it was coming from another world. Something touched him, icy fingers brushing against his skin. He spun around, his eyes wide with terror, but there was no one there. The shape had melded with the darkness. The very air itself had become a part of it. The walls of the submersible seemed to grow closer, pressing in on him, until the cabin felt too small to contain his frantic thoughts. "It's here," the whisper echoed once more, but this time it wasn't in his mind. It was in the very air around him, in the cabin, in the walls. It was everywhere. In that moment, Alexander understood. He had been chosen, but not as a savior, not as a hero. He had been chosen to become the abyss, to become part of the ocean that had no beginning, no end, no mercy. It would consume him, just as it had consumed countless others before him. And it would wait, biding its time, until another fool, another vessel, wandered too close. The figure wasn't something external. It wasn't a creature that existed in the physical world. It was the ocean itself, the endless, undying, unknowable void. The figure was a manifestation, a symptom of something far older than humanity, older than the earth itself. It had always been there, in the depths, watching, waiting. And now, it had found him. With his last breath, Alexander reached for the control panel, his fingers trembling as he tried to activate the emergency ascent. But his hand faltered, his vision blurry, his body too weak to fight anymore. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled the cabin, reverberating through his skull. They were inside him, their presence overwhelming. It was then that the walls around him seemed to dissolve. The darkness folded in on itself, and the submersible began to twist, bend, and warp as if it were made of paper, crumpling in the hands of an unseen force. The cold grew unbearable, the water pressing in from every direction. But Alexander did not fight it. He didn't need to. The ocean was claiming him now, and there was no escape. His body felt weightless, as though he were floating in a dream. His mind was shattering, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was no longer alone. He had become part of the abyss. As the last of his consciousness slipped away, there was one final whisper, a promise that he would never be forgotten. Not in the way that men are forgotten, but in a way that transcended time, space, and death. He would be a part of the deep, a part of the void, forever. The figure, no longer a shape, but an essence, watched from the depths. And in the darkness, Alexander's name would echo, along with the names of all who had come before him, and all who would come after him. For the abyss does not forget. It only waits. End. This conclusion paints Alexander's descent into the unknown as a final acceptance of his fate. The abyss, the entity that had haunted him throughout his journey, claims him in the end, becoming a part of him. The narrative ends in ambiguity, leaving open the possibility that his story is not over, that the ocean continues to wait, and those who venture too close may find themselves consumed, as Alexander was.